Rebecca came to live with us after Grandpa died. And she was a very tall, very patrician woman, spoke with a French accent, taught me French songs, and she had diabetes. And I used to watch her give herself the insulin shots, and it just amazed me that she could do that without crying or screaming, or she just gave herself the shots in her hip. Anyway, as she died on Thanksgiving Day, and I was about 13, I think. And that was really the end of my grandparents. My father's parents died, well, I can't remember. My grandma Bordy died when I was about 18 or 19. And I don't remember when my grandpa Bordy died, but I didn't like him, so I guess I didn't care. Anyway, I had lots of cousins, aunts and uncles, who were very close, and they would come and stay at our house. They lived in Fremont, they lived in Walt Hill, they lived in little towns in Nebraska, and they would come to Omaha, and they would stay with us. And people would be sleeping on the floor, they were all over the place, but it was always fun. And I know that my aunts told dirty stories, because I would hear them laughing. And I mean, they were just, I think they told some pretty good stories. Anyway, they were all long-lived. My father's sisters all lived a very long time. As a matter of fact, my Aunt Rose, I think, lived to be 95. My Aunt Sadie was about 93. And you all met her at David and Rebecca's wedding. She was very old, in a wheelchair.
Let's go back and mention all those by name, their married name, and just as much detail as you can give us.
Okay. Well, let's see. I think my favorite aunts were my mother's sisters. When I was little, they were my favorite aunts. They were Aunt Eva and Aunt Esther, and they lived in Aberdeen. They weren't married. They were way ahead of their time. They had a touring car, and they would drive. Actually, women didn't drive much in those days. They would drive from Aberdeen to Omaha. And when they owned this store, and they had very fancy clothes in the store, and they would bring boxes of clothes, and they would be like formal dresses. And we'd dress up in them and prance around. And when they were going to come, I would sit on the front porch waiting for them to come. Sometimes I'd sit there for 2 or 3 days waiting for them to come. Anyway, my Aunt Eva died when she was 35, and she died in our house. I think she had high blood pressure. Nobody ever really talked about it. My Aunt Esther, after my Aunt Eva died, married. She married a man named Irving Light, who my father disliked intensely because he thought he was a fortune hunter. Anyway, they had a child, and they named her Renee, but they always called her Precious, so she was Precious Light. And they eventually sold the store in Aberdeen, and they moved to California, and we kind of lost track of them. Eventually, Aunt Esther and Irving divorced, and that proved to my father that he was right all the time, that he was a no-goodnik. Anyway, then, let's see, there was my Uncle Abe, who lived in Aberdeen, who was a state senator in South Dakota, or North Dakota. I never can remember if it's North Dakota or South Dakota. Anyway, he was a state senator. We used to call him our drinking uncle, because he would get pretty plowed at parties and things. And he was married, and he had 2 children, Bubbles and Jack. And Bubbles was my sister Judy's age. She was 5 years younger than me. And Bubbles, unfortunately, now has Alzheimer's and doesn't really know anybody. She lives in St. Louis. And her brother Jack lives in Minneapolis. And unfortunately, he also has Alzheimer's. And his mother had Alzheimer's at a very young age, at about 60. So I guess this is what happened. Anyway, actually Jack and his wife Susan were here about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we all had lunch. And he's a really dear man and is handling this very well, very realistically. Okay, so that's my Uncle Abe. Then there was Dan, Uncle Dan, who lived in Jamestown, North Dakota, or South Dakota. And he had a store. They all had stores. They were all merchants. And he had a store, and he had a line of dresses, and he named them Betty Ray Dresses, and that was after me. So I was very famous in Jamestown, North Dakota or South Dakota. Then he married, and he was married, and then they moved to California, and we kind of lost touch with them. So that, and then I'm trying to think who else. My mother had her oldest brother was Israel, and I really never knew him. And then there was Uncle Ben, who was the baby of the family, and he lived in Walt Hill. He also had stores. He was a little slow, and he died about 10 or 12 years ago. Now my father's family, I talked about there was Aunt Rose and Uncle Lou. They lived in Fremont. It was Predmetsky was their, Lou was a Predmetsky. He was a cousin to my mother. And they had a daughter named Florine, and her name is Florine Gattell, and she lives in California. And then there was my Uncle Bess, my Aunt Bess, who was married to Jack Schwartz. And they had a daughter named Arlene. So Arlene and Florine and I were all about the same age, maybe a 1 or 2 years difference. And we just hung out all the time together. We were great friends. And then, that's just later when I went away to school, and we really lost touch with each other. And then my father had a brother named Simon, and Simon moved to Omaha very early. He was married to a woman named Ida Cavich, and she was from Columbus. And they had 3 children, Lawrence, Bernice Green, and Reva Chapman. And Reva and Bernice live in Omaha, and Lawrence died quite young. So that takes care of most of the... Oh, Aunt Sadie was married to a man named Sam Dolesker. They stayed in the store in Walt Hill after we moved to Omaha. And they have a child named Rita Lee, and she lives in Denver, and we email each other a lot. And she sends me a lot of emails. So I think that's all. That's Simon, Sadie, Rose, Bess. That's it. Okay, these were my aunts and uncles and cousins, and we were all very close. It was a huge family. When everybody got together, it was lots of people.
What were those getting-togethers like?
Oh, they were wonderful. Well, we used to have, in the summer, we would always have picnics in Fremont. And there was this park that we went to that was across the street from Rose and Lou's house. And Rose and Lou lived about 3 blocks from Grandma and Grandpa. And so we would just shuttle back and forth. But we would go to this park, and everybody would bring their specialty. My Aunt Bess would bring her baked beans that were incredible. There would always be a tub with watermelon in it, and ice, and pop, and there was always fried chicken, and there were always brownies, and potato salad. That was where I learned to eat potato salad, which is one of my favorite foods. And we would have picnics probably at least once, as I recall, once a month in the summer. And everybody would come from all over. And it was wonderful. They were wonderful times. When we would go to Seder, though, at Grandma and Grandpa's in Fremont, we would sit at the table until 11, 12 o'clock at night, falling asleep. It was no fun at all. And I think we were all pretty glad when we didn't have to go to those seders anymore. I remember once my brother-in-law Al Fiddler was married to my sister Ruth. They were just, I don't think they had been married very long, and we went to Seder in Fremont. And Al was a real jokester. And when they opened the door for the prophet to come in, the prophet Elijah, Al walked in, Al had sneaked out and he walked in the door. And my grandpa was not happy. Everybody else thought it was pretty funny. My grandpa was very angry. Anyway, there was just a lot, there were a lot of get-togethers. We just got together a lot. It was a very close family, and everybody got along with everybody. I'm sure that, there were little tiffs here and there, but generally, everybody got along and cared about each other a lot. But those people are all gone now.
What was life like growing up in a small town as a young girl?
Well, I didn't grow up actually in Walt Hill. I was 4 when we left Walt Hill. So I don't remember much about it from those years. But because my cousin Arlene was still there, and Rita Lee was still there were 2 families that took over my father's store. And so I would go back in the summers and visit. And those are my memories of Walt Hill. And I loved it. I just loved it. I mean, we could walk everywhere. And we were free to just go whenever, wherever we wanted to go. And I probably did that until I was 13 or 14. And then after that, they would come to Omaha for parties and things, and I didn't go to Walt Hill anymore. And then they eventually moved. But I just really loved that freedom of just being able to go. You could cover the whole town in probably an hour. And there was a fairgrounds we'd go to and swing, and there was a park, and we'd take sandwiches. And my Aunt Bess made the best lunches in the world. And lunch was always the big meal of the day. And so we would always go to Aunt Bess's for lunch. And she was a great cook. We go back to Walt Hill now. Well, all of you kids have gone to Walt Hill with me, except for Joanne. Oh wait, Jan hasn't gone. Oh, Carolyn hasn't gone. David is gone.
Is the old store still there?
The store is still there, but it's empty. And it became a laundromat. At one time it was a laundromat. The town is so sad. It's just breaks your heart. But it's like all those little towns, most of them. Store after storefront, there's nothing in there. They've tried valiantly to kind of decorate things. And of course, it's an Indian reservation, and so it's very poor. And when David and I were there last October, it was just so sad. And you saw these young Indian men just hanging around the streets, just loitering, just obviously having nothing to do, and probably not much in their pockets. And it's a very sad place now. But at one time, it was a booming little town.
At that time, were there any other Jewish families living there?
Yes, there were. Yes. Well, there were my aunts and uncles. And then there was a family called the Robinsons, Sid Robinsons. They had a grocery store. And I think there was another family. I'm not sure. But an interesting thing is my daughter, Joanne, who was married to a man named Robert Russell, his grandfather was the station master in Walt Hill and knew my parents. And but of course my parents were, by the time Joanne met Bob and married him, my parents were no longer here. So, but I know that they knew. I know they had to have known each other. And 6 degrees of separation.
If we go way back to
Yeah.
your grandparents, how did they end up in this part of the country?
I don't know that. And my father used to tell stories that nobody listened to. And like everybody else I know who's my age says, oh, why didn't we listen? Why didn't we write it down? And we didn't. And so I don't really know. I think, I know with my mother's family, some of them settled in New York, in the East. How they came to Nebraska, I have no idea. And with my father's family, I assume that somebody else was already there, and that, they went west. But,
Well, going back to your earliest education, elementary school, what can you tell me about that?
Well,
Where did you go?
I went to Washington grade school. We lived at 5640 Leavenworth Street, and Washington was about 5 blocks away, up a hill. And I went there started there in kindergarten, and went through 8th grade there. And it was a great experience. And we always walked. I mean, my mother didn't drive anyway, but we walked. We walked in the snow, we walked in the sleet. You know the old stories about, I walked through 10 feet of snow to get to school. Well, we did. And my mother used to make me wear, if it was really cold, long underwear. And the minute I got out of the house, about a block from the house, I'd stop and roll it up. Because we wore dresses in those days. We didn't wear pants to school. Whoever heard of such a thing? And so I would roll them up, and they'd keep falling down during the day. But we would tramp through the snow, and that's how we got to school.
And then would you come home for lunch?
We'd come home for lunch. Yeah, every day we'd come home for lunch, and then go back to school again. And English was my favorite subject, and I was really good at it. And my sister Judy tells me that I was sick once, and that the teacher came to visit me. Now, I don't remember that, but she says that she did, and which I guess is pretty unusual. Teachers don't make house calls. But I was very bad in math, and I'm still not very good, but I loved English. And I think I was in about 6th grade when they did this project where if you were a really good reader, you went to the lower classes and you read. You would read a book to them. And I got to do that, so I was very proud. But I used to get D's in math, and I remember once I don't know what grade I was in, but I actually forged my mother's name on my report card. And believe it or not, they caught it. And they called my mother to school, and they called me, and actually it was the first time I think I ever saw my mother cry. She was so embarrassed that I had done that. But I think I got an F in math or something, and I just was so ashamed I couldn't. I thought, well, I know how she writes her name. But obviously I didn't. Anyway.
Do you retain any names of some of the kids you went to school with?
I don't. I mean, I would have maybe 10 years ago, but now I don't anymore. I know houses where people lived. And as a matter of fact, we took a ride, was it when Judy was here? We took a ride over to the school and went by a house that I remember that was very hurtful to me. It was a girl, and I don't remember her name, but I used to play with her a lot. And one day I went to her house and I remember knocking on the side door, and she came to the door and she said, I can't play with you anymore. And I said, why? And she said, because you're Jewish. And I think that was the first time that I experienced anti-Semitism. And I couldn't understand that. It just didn't make any sense to me. I'd been Jewish all along. But maybe I don't know. Anyway, it was terrible. It was just a terrible thing. And I saw this woman. I went to my 50th reunion, and she was there. And she came over to me, and the minute I saw her, I remembered that's who she was, and that had done this thing to me. And she was very cordial to me, and I was very haughty. And I don't, I hopefully she's not so anti-Semitic anymore, I don't know. Anyway, I got a very, very good education at Washington School. And then, of course, I went to Central. And I loved Central. And of course, all of my kids go to Central. My grandson goes to Central. And it was, I think, an incredible education. I loved the register. I was on the register staff. As a matter of fact, I had a column. And the name of the column was Boys at War with Bordy. And I would interview boys who came back, who were in the Army, who came back, and I would interview them, or else I would scour the newspaper and, cut out little articles, and then I'd write an article based on the article that I'd read. And of course, I didn't keep any of that. I don't know if it would be in the archives there or not. But anyway, working on the staff of the Register was an incredible experience. And I loved Central. I made a lot of good friends there. And at Central, I met the woman who really changed my life. Okay, I was sitting in study hall. It was when I was a freshman. And somebody passed me down the line and passed me a note. And the note said, "Are you Jewish?" And I turned around to see who had written the note. And here was this blonde, blue-eyed girl smiling at me, pointing, saying, "It's me, it's me." And I thought, what in the world does that, Gentile girl want to know if I'm Jewish? Well, anyway, after study hall, we talked. Turned out she was Jewish. She had gone to Dundee. She lived on 50th and Farnham. And all of her friends, she didn't have any Jewish friends because she apparently hadn't gone to Sunday school or anything. And her mother had said to her, "Now, Cece, when you go to Central, you have to meet some Jewish kids because all your friends, you don't have any Jewish friends and you need to meet Jewish friends." So she looked around, she saw me, she decided I looked Jewish. And so she sent me this note. Well, as everybody knows, we became fast friends. And she's been a huge influence in my life. Anyway, we went away to college together.
What was her name?
Her name was Cece Cohn. Her name is now Cece Milder. And she lives in California. And we went to the University of Iowa together. There were 7 of us from Omaha that went. And but Cece only stayed 1 year because she got married, which I thought was a big mistake. But anyway, she got married. And so anyway, we'll pick up with Cece again later. But she was beautiful. She, and all the boys were just crazy about her because here was this blonde Jew, there weren't too many of them. And anyway, I had a lot of friends, and I guess I joined the sorority, and we just did all kinds of things, things that, well, it was different than it is now because we didn't go out in groups. When we dated. We had, one guy we'd go out with, and it's very different from the way it is now. And you'd go steady with somebody, and then you'd break up, and then you'd go steady with somebody else, and then you'd have times when you didn't have anybody to go to date, and then you'd stay home on Saturday night. You wouldn't show your face because you would be ashamed to show your face that anybody would know you didn't have a date on Saturday night. Anyway, I eventually graduated from Central, and didn't want to go to the University of Nebraska. I wanted to go away to school. And my sister Fran had gone to the University of Iowa, and my cousin Bernice had gone there, and my cousin Reva had gone there. And so I decided that was the place for me. And I talked Cece into going, and I talked some other people into going. Anyway, there were 7 of us who got on the train and went to Iowa City. And that was absolutely great. And we went in 1943. And we all joined the sorority. And we all stayed there all together except for Cece, who got married. And I majored in economics, of all things. This math genius majored in economics. I majored in economics because my cousin Reva majored in economics. I wasn't very original. Anyway, I liked it, and I was really pretty good. I mean, I was much better at it. It really didn't involve figures. What I wanted to do, what I envisioned was that I would graduate and I would become a personnel management in a company. And I would interview people and hire and fire, and that was my plan. But of course I didn't do that, as you all know. When I was a senior, I dated a lot of different people when I was at the University of Iowa. I actually went, I guess, steady with a man named Stan Myers, and we called him Tojo because he looked like Tojo. He was in the Navy. He was in the AST, not ASTP because that was Army, but he was in the Navy and stationed in Chicago. But he would come back to Iowa City on weekends, and we were together for about 2 years, my sophomore and junior year. And then we broke up in my senior year, and that was when I met Al. Love of my life. Okay, so I'll tell you how I met Al. We're sitting at a bridge table. It was school, hadn't started yet. It was in September, and there were a few people at the house already, and enough for a bridge game anyway. And so there we were sitting playing bridge, and these 2 men walked in, 2 guys. And one was short and dark, and one was very tall and blonde. And they kind of stood around and kibitzed, and the tall blonde was very funny, had a great sense of humor. And his name was Al Cutler. And he had come back to Iowa. He had been at school, and then he went into the Army. And the war was over now, so he was back, and he had been in the ASTP in the Army, and he had studied communications, and he never really fought. He'd gone. He was at the University of Wisconsin. He was at the University of Florida. He had a really nice time. Anyway, I thought he was adorable. And apparently he thought I was okay, because later that day he called and asked me if I wanted to go out to dinner. And of course I did, and that was the beginning. And from that time on, we were inseparable. And anyway, so what did we, we used to listen. There was a program on the radio called The Honeymooners. And it later, I think, was on television with Jackie Gleason. But this was radio. And it would be on Sunday night. And Sunday nights, they didn't serve dinner at the house. And so we would go out to dinner, and then we'd come back, and we'd lay on the floor by the radio in the living room at the SDT house, and listen to the Honeymooners and just laugh. And those were things I remember, little snatches of things like that. And he was always funny. He just always had a great sense of humor. Anyway.
Well, what was a typical date like now?
Well, he didn't have a lot of money. And so we'd go out for a hamburger or something, and we'd go to a movie. Or a lot of times we'd just walk. We'd just walk around campus. Especially, when the weather was good. When it got cold, sometimes we'd go to the Union, and we'd sit and we'd have coffee, and we'd just talk. we did a lot of walking. And then, he'd come over to the house and we'd, listen to the radio, or we'd go to dance. There were always dances. The fraternity had, he was a Phi Ep, and they would have parties, and we would go to the parties there, and then we'd have parties at the SGT house, and we'd dance and just hang out with our friends, and he was always kind of the life of the party at school. He was not good around people he didn't know. Once he got to know you, then he was, he was great. But he was very quiet around people that he didn't know, around strangers and around big crowds. But in a little group, he was just great. Anyway, I graduated in June, and my parents came up, and my sister Fran came for the graduation, and he was not going to graduate until, I think it was August, because he still had some credits to make up. So he came to Omaha on the 4th of July, and I just had a feeling that he was going to ask me to marry him, and he did. But he took the train in from Iowa City, and he, I don't remember what happened. I didn't drive. Oh, I know, my sister's, we went to a movie, that's what happened. We went to a movie, and his train was going to be in like at 10 or 10:30 or something like that. And we went to this movie, and the movie wasn't over, and I knew that the train was going to be in, and I made everybody leave, and they were really mad at me because they didn't get to see the end of the movie. And we got there late, and he was mad because we didn't pick him up. We picked him up. We were like maybe a half hour late. And here he was, chomping at the bit. He had this ring and everything, and nobody was there to meet him. Anyway, that night he asked me to marry him, and he gave me a beautiful ring. And I said yes. And then I went up, well, I think he stayed with us. Well, I'm sure he stayed with us. Where else would he stay? Yeah. Anyway, my parents were really happy because they liked him. And we decided that we would marry in October. And we married on October 12th, 1947. Yeah, 1947. And we got married at the Blackstone Hotel in the ballroom. And all of my sisters were my bridesmaids. And they wore the ugliest dresses you ever saw. But the war hadn't been over very long, and it was very, very hard to find things. And we actually had to go to Lincoln to find the dresses, and they were just awful. But everybody had a different color, and they were the fall colors. And they were, well, you've all seen the pictures. They were just really, these sisters must have loved me a lot to wear those dresses in public. But anyway, they did. And it was a wonderful wedding. We went to Florida on our honeymoon, and then we went back to Waterloo, and that was where we were going to live.
Was that where he was from?
That was where he was from, Waterloo, Iowa, right. His father was a merchant and had a store, just like my family. And his mother had worked in the store. He had one brother named Henry, who was younger than he. Henry was, I think, 3 years younger than Al. And Al was going to go into the business with his father, although he really didn't want to do that. He had majored in advertising, and that was what he wanted to do. But his father wasn't very well, and so he thought, well, he needed to give him that time. And actually what happened was that in November, very shortly after we married, after we got back, his father got worse and went to Rochester, was diagnosed with cancer of the stomach, and came back, and he died in February. And Al was very devoted to his mother, and she was a strong woman in many ways, but a very dependent woman. And he wouldn't leave, he was afraid to leave her. And so we lived, and it was a big house. It was a very nice big house. And we lived in this big house with Sarah. And it was not a very happy situation. She was a really domineering woman. But I mean, he would say to me, how can I sit down to dinner when I know my mother is sitting in her house by herself eating? How can I do that? And I understood where he was coming from. Anyway, so we stayed. And we always said, well, we're going to leave next year. And we're going to leave next year. And the truth is we never left. And anyway, we decided to have children. And in 1951, Carolyn Diane was born. A beautiful little girl. And he wasn't really gung-ho on having kids. I mean, he thought, well, it was, we didn't really need to. He was so enamored of her. I mean, he absolutely adored her. Anything she wanted, anything at all. He was her slave. And then we decided that it was time to have another, and we had Jana Lynn. She was born in 53. And and he loved her as much as he'd loved Caroline. And these kids never wanted to go to bed at night. Never. But he would read to them for hours, and he'd sing to them, and he was a really terrific father. Then along came Joanne in 1955, and so we had 3 little girls, and they were wonderful, wonderful little children. And my mother-in-law wasn't too happy because they were all dark-eyed and black hair, and she really wanted a blonde. And so she made it quite clear that, another one of those. Anyway, in 1960, David was born. And when I was pregnant with David, everybody would say to Al, well, I know now you really, want to have a boy. And he would say, no, I'm really happy with my girls. If it's another girl, that's great. Well, it was a little boy. We named him David. After Al's Father's Day was David. And he was a beautiful little boy. On the way home from the hospital, Al had been having headaches. And in those days, when you had a baby, you stayed in the hospital for a full week. They treated you like a queen. You just slept and ate and just kind of meandered up and down the halls after the first couple days, and it was you had a lot of time to get to know your baby and to recoup without having to worry about changing diapers or making formula or doing any of that stuff. Anyway, on the way home, bringing David home, Al got sick, and I had to then drive the rest of the way home. And he would have these terrible headaches, and it was shortly after David was born that he finally went to the doctor, and the doctor said, you need to go to Rochester, which is what we did. And it turned out he was diagnosed with a brain cancer. He had surgery. He had surgery in October of 1960. And it turned out that it was not an encapsulated tumor. It was, the way it was described to me it was like weeds growing in a garden. And they could pick out little bits of it. But they couldn't take the whole thing. because it would damage him too much. He could lose his speech, he could lose his ability to walk, he could lose, they wanted to leave something there. And the name of his doctor was Dr. Love. But he was one of the most distant, cold men I've ever known in my life. But I think he was probably a good doctor. Anyway, we went home. We did the surgery and he was okay. He was not the same, but he was okay, and he had not lost any facilities. He could walk, he could talk, he could think. And we would have to go back to Rochester. I think we went back every 6 months for checkups. And the first few times we went back, he was really feeling great. And it was like a little mini vacation. We would stay in a hotel. And we'd actually, if the weather was good, we'd take our golf clubs and we'd play golf. And I think that for the first year and a half, he did really well. But, we always knew that he was not going to survive it. And I'm trying to, let me see the date. This was October of about 62. He became very confused and very angry. And we were in Rochester, and they said that there had been a recurrence, and so he took cobalt treatments there. And unfortunately, they weren't very successful. He stayed in the hospital there for some time and then was transferred to the Veterans Hospital in Iowa City. And he stayed there until the spring of '63, and then he came home. They were doing X-ray treatments in cobalt in Iowa City. He came home. He was not the same man. He was easily angered. And anyway, in November of that year of '63, I went to my brother-in-law Henry and said, he can't be there with the children any longer. And so he was hospitalized, and he died. We didn't know, he didn't talk then. He had lost his ability to talk. And we didn't know whether or not he knew what we were talking about when we talked to him, except he was in the hospital when Kennedy was shot. And my brother-in-law Henry walked into the hospital room, and he said, Kennedy was shot today and killed. And I looked over, and there were tears running down Al's face. So I knew that he knew, that he understood when we talked to him. He died on Christmas Day of 1963. We had talked during those 3 years, and he had said, when I die, I want you to take the kids and go to Omaha. That's where your family is. Don't stay here. And so we moved to Omaha in August of '64. August 1st, we moved into this house.
Betty, tell me about your life in Waterloo.
Oh, okay. Well, there were lots of young people our age, and so we made a lot of good friends there. But our very best friends were Lois and Mel Wolfe, I had gone to school with Lois. Lois was from Milwaukee, and she was a sorority sister of mine. And Mel was in law school, and they married while they were still in school. And Lois and Mel were really dear friends of ours. And when he graduated, he didn't know where to go to practice. And we said, you know, there are no Jewish lawyers in Waterloo, and you really ought to come to Waterloo. And they did. Surprisingly enough, they did. Anyway, and they came to Waterloo, and they were a big part of our lives, and always have been. Then there was Sid and Rosella Wiseman, and Sid and Al had been friends for many, many years. And all the years that they were both going to stop smoking, And finally they made this big deal where they were going to stop on a certain date. And if one of them, whoever started smoking again, had to pay the other one the huge sum of $25. And so Al really did quit. He really did. And apparently Sid really didn't, because several months had gone by and they were just patting each other on the back, how good they were doing and everything. And one day Al is driving home and he looks over and there's Sid in his car next to him and he's smoking a cigarette. So Al collected the $25 and then he started smoking again. Unfortunately, and so, you know, and I had never stopped, unfortunately. Anyway, they were good friends of ours. We took a trip with them to Grand Lake, Colorado. That was before we had kids. And on that trip I found out that Rosella was pregnant with her third, I think. Anyway, we played a lot of golf. We played a lot of bridge. We belonged to the synagogue. And I was really active in Hadassah and the sisterhood, and we did plays in the synagogue, and they were great fun. It was really fun. It was a good life. It was a very good life. We had Al was a stockbroker at that time, and he was working for a company in Des Moines called Wittenstein, or Wittenberg. Anyway, I can't remember which, but anyway, that's what he was doing. And we would take trips to Chicago, and with friends, and we saw movies, and we watched television, and we used to take Sunday morning picnics with our kids, and there was this park in Cedar Falls that we would go to. It was kind of on a hill, and we'd take bacon and eggs and coffee and a whole big breakfast, and we'd do it all summer long, because it was a way for us to get away from Sarah and just be off by ourselves. And we used to do that. We did it for several years. And we did things with our kids. We took them, well, they were very involved in the synagogue too. And Carolyn actually was bat mitzvah there with some of her friends. They had a group bat mitzvah. And Jan and Joanne were too young for that. And anyway, but they all went to Sunday school, and they all had good friends. And it was a very free time. It was a very free time. It wasn't like it is now, where you just have to worry about your kids out on, out playing outside or whatever. Kids could walk over to their friends' houses. Nobody worried about it. It was a very simple time. And it was a very good life we had, if it weren't for Sarah. But that's another story. Anyway, I'm trying to think what else we did in Waterloo. Well, we'd have dinner with friends in different houses. We had progressive dinners where people would, everybody would bring something, a lot of potlucks. It was a good life. And I played some duplicate bridge there, and I wasn't very good at it. And Al was not a very good bridge player. We didn't play a lot of men and women bridge. Women played bridge and the men played something else, poker or whatever, because most of the men weren't very good bridge players, and we were much better. So that, and golf was a big part of our life. It was a good time.
Do the kids remember growing up a little bit there?
Oh yeah, they do. As a matter of fact, they go back to Waterloo fairly often when they visit. Well, when my oldest daughter Carolyn lives in Colorado, she lives in Lafayette, Colorado, and when she comes to visit, well, she came 2 years ago. She came. We've taken 2 trips together back to Waterloo. We did a year ago in the summer, and a couple years before that. And the house that we lived in is totally changed. These people that bought it painted it. It was a kind of a yellow brick house, and now it's a white brick house. And it doesn't even look like the same house. But they have good memories of Waterloo. David doesn't have, really, because he was only 3 when we left. But the girls have very fond memories. And, the school they went to is still there. And actually, the synagogue is still there, which is pretty amazing because the Jewish population has mostly died off. And who hasn't died off has mostly left. But I think they still have a rabbi. Yes, my kids, they loved, and I often think how different our lives would have been if Al hadn't died. If I had stayed there, if I hadn't moved away, our lives would have been totally different. But that's not what happened. So, anyway,
I'd like you to name your siblings for me.
Okay. My oldest sister is Ruth Fiddler. She married Al Fiddler. And they have 2 children. Donald Fiddler, who lives here, is my nephew, and we're very close. And his older sister, Sandy, who is an artist and lives in New York. And then my sister, Neoma. Neoma and Ruth were like, I don't know, they were maybe 15 months apart, very close. And Neoma married Seymour Cohn. Seymour was from Council Bluffs. And she married young. She was 18 when she married. And they have a daughter, Rocky Stern. And then there's Norman, my brother Norman, who married Babe Margolin. And they had 2 children, Roz, what's Roz's last name? Block, Roz Block. She lives in Denver. She lives in Colorado Springs. And Bobby Bordy, who also lives in Colorado Springs. And Frances, my sister Frances, who married Bob Bernstein. And they have 2 children, Jeff, who lives in Peachtree City, Georgia, and Julie Metcalf, who lives in Bellevue. And that's Frances. Then there's me. And then my youngest sister, Judy, lives in New York. She went to the University of Iowa, and then she transferred to Oklahoma. And in Oklahoma, she met a man named Hannon Swiskay, and he was from New York. And she didn't do what my parents, when I went away to school, my parents said to me, just don't bring home a New Yorker. And she brought home a New Yorker. The reason they didn't want us to bring home a New Yorker was because you couldn't know anything about their family, I guess. That must have been the reason. But anyway, she brought home a New Yorker. But he was a prize. He was something. Anyway, so she married this man named Hannon Swiskay, and they lived in Long Island, and they have 3 children. Dana Mullins, who lives in upstate New York, Jeffrey Swiskay, who lives in New York, and Michael Swiskay, who lives in New York. Dana is married and has 2 children. Michael and Jeffrey are not married. And those are my siblings. Those are my family. Daughter, Carolyn Diane. well, she's one of the joys of my life. She is a wonderful person. That's, she's lively, she's independent, she's smart, she's caring, she's, well, okay, we're going to talk about it. She was very, very devastated by her father's death because she was the oldest, and of course had spent more time with him than anybody, and he adored her so. For her, well, for everybody it was awful, but for her I think it was a greater loss than for anybody, including me, because I was an adult and I could understand what was happening. She was a child and she couldn't understand. Anyway, she had, when we lived in Waterloo, she had her very best friend was Dee Dee Strom, who lived one house over. And she and Dee Dee were very good friends, but they were very competitive. It was like, who was going to get the better grade? If Dee Dee got an A and Carolyn didn't get an A, that wasn't a happy situation. Anyway, they were very good, and she had there were like 7 of them that were really good friends, but Dee Dee was absolutely her best friend. And it was very hard for her to move to Omaha. She was at a bad stage in her life. She was 13 years old, which is a really awful time to uproot a child, take them away from everybody they know, and dump them in a new place with nobody they know. And I would say the first 6 months that we lived here, she just sat in the basement. She didn't go anywhere. She was determined that she was not going to be happy. And nothing you did could make her happy. But then it was time, well, she went to school. I mean, we moved here in August, so she started school, and she went to Lewis and Clark. And she began to make some friends. But she was not happy with me. I mean, she felt like I had taken her away from everything that mattered to her, and that was a selfish thing on my part. And so she wasn't too thrilled with me, and she wasn't too pleasant to me. And I understood what she was going through, but I couldn't reach her. There was no way I could reach her. And I remember she said she wrote a letter to her Aunt Lynn, who was my brother-in-law Henry's wife, and complaining. And Lynn wrote her back, I guess, not a very sympathetic letter, saying, kid, just get it together, in so many words. Get it together. Your mother did the best thing that she could for you. Anyway, I think she has now forgiven me. And she is she moved to, she went to Lewis and Clark, and then she went to Central, and then she went to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and she wanted to be a teacher. And so that's what she became. And I think she became a very good teacher. She taught always elementary, kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And, but she was the kind of teacher who was constantly changing. I mean, I think a lot of teachers get a plan, and that's what they do. Every year it's always the same. But I don't think that was true of Carolyn. Carolyn spent a lot of time revising her plan, revising her methods, and consequently, she didn't have much time for herself, because at night, she would be at home, working on the next day. And, I thought, well, by the time you've taught for 4 or 5 years, you've got this system in place, you just do it. But that is not her style. So eventually she decided that she'd had enough of teaching. She didn't like it that much. She didn't want to do it anymore. She had to find something new. And so we talked, at length about what she could do. She took a leave of absence, and she loved it. She really should have been the child of a very wealthy person, where she inherited a whole lot of money, and all she had to do was just kind of hang around, go to the coffee shop, read a good book. Anyway, she actually didn't work for a couple of years. With this leave of absence, she did a lot of research into what she might do, and she couldn't decide. Actually, never came up with anything. She went back to school. She got her master's degree, and I've got a picture of her on the refrigerator with her cap and her gown, and she's just an incredibly good person. She now has a job. She ran for city council in Lafayette, Colorado, and she won. And she is now sitting on the city council. She was on the planning department for 2 or 3 years. So she's very involved in the community. And actually she came in, I think there were 5 new people who were elected, and she was the second highest getter of votes. And she also got a new job, and she's working as the kindergarten director for after-school programs. And I think she's probably doing a really good job of it. She's coming here on the 22nd of December, and she went to Colorado. She went to visit Dave and Rebecca at Thanksgiving. So she really does try and keep in touch with the family. And she never married. She's a really independent young woman, and I'm very proud of her. My next child is Jana Lynn, and Jana was born in 1955. She has always been a really caring child. I mean, she was Grandma, she was Sarah's protector. She was Sarah's best friend. And after we moved out of Waterloo, she made it her business and she was just young, she was 9, 10. She worried about Sarah. Nobody else cared about Sarah, but she cared about Sarah. And as the years went by, when she was 18, she would take trips to Waterloo on the bus, and she would sit on the bus for like 10, 11 hours to get to Waterloo. She had to change, and she'd do it in the middle of winter. She'd maybe only be there for a day or 2 days. She'd do her laundry. She'd do Sarah's laundry. And then she'd have to take the trip back, another 10 and 11 hours. And she did this because she always felt like Sarah was alone in the world, and Sarah was, because Henry had also died. I mean, this was a tragedy. This was a woman who had 2 sons, and they both died young. So she was left alone, and she was very bitter. And so she really was alienated from most of her friends. And without Jan, I don't know what she would have done. But Jan was there for her all the time, always there for her. And she's a woman who can't say no. She hasn't learned how to say no. I mean, she gets mad at herself for not saying no, but she still says yes, no matter what anybody asks her to do. If you need somebody to do something, ask Jan. She can be really mad when she hears this. But that's what she does. And she works for Omaha Public Schools. She is a secretary at Omaha Public Schools. She has a wonderful son named Zachary Alan Cutler. And she adores him. She is the best mother in the world. She is just, they're such good friends. They're not just mother and son, they're good friends. He just tells her everything. I mean, but she's still his mother. And she still says, no, you can't do that, or yes, you can do that. And I think she's a very, very successful mother. And I'm very proud of her. And she, I don't know what I would do without her, because she takes care of me. She brings my laundry up, or he brings my laundry up. She's taking care of me like she took care of Sarah, except thank God she doesn't have to ride on the bus for 10 hours to do it. And she's a very special human being. I have great respect for her, and I love her dearly. My next daughter is Joanne. Now, Joanne she's terrific. She's very volatile. She has a temper. She is very beautiful, but all my children are very beautiful. She has 2 children, Hannah and Elise. And she's married to Bob Russell. They live in Washington, D.C. They lived in Omaha to begin with. They met when Bob was the director of the Children's Museum, and Joanne was working at the Children's Museum, and they fell in love. And then they married in 1985, and then Hannah was born. They married in June of 1985, and Hannah was born in August of 1986. And they had moved to Lansing, Michigan, where Bob was the director of a museum there. And then Elise was born in Lansing, and then they eventually moved to Washington, D.C., and they've been in Washington ever since. Joanne, if Joanne applies for a job, she gets it. She's dynamic. She's probably the most dynamic of all of my children. She's very caring. She, we talk often, and she's, what can I say about her? She's incredible. She's very honest about herself and about her feelings, about her life, about what she wants to do. She's interesting. She's got an interesting slant on things, and she's also a lot of fun. She can be tons of fun. If she's feeling silly, everybody is silly. And hopefully she's going to come when Carolyn and David and Addie are coming, and Carolyn's coming, and I hope Joanne is going to be able to come. She's trying to work it out. So then we would all be together, because it doesn't happen very often that we're all together at the same time. And sometimes when they are, I look around and I think, how did we all live in this house? It's not that big. But we did, and we did it for a lot of years. Anyway, Joanne, as I say, Joanne's a really special, she's a special person. And then now I probably didn't spend as much time on Joanne. Joanne deserves all the time that I've got. But she's not going to get it. Because I'm moving on to David, who Joanne tells me is my favorite. Well, he's my son. What else? I'm a Jewish mother. He's my son, and he's a doctor. Anyway, David is, he's so much like his father that is just amazing, because this is a man he didn't know. He's tall, like his father, although he has black hair. And he has the same kind of sense of humor, and he does the same little thing with his mouth that his father did. And he's also got the same kind of dry look on the outlook on life. He's married to a wonderful Rebecca, and they have one child, Addie, who is going to be 12. No, Addie was born in 1995, yeah. So and her birthday's in January. Anyway, David is a podiatrist. He went to all my kids went to Harrison School, except for Carolyn. And the reason that this is the house I picked is because I looked at it and thought, there's a school right across the street. I never have to drive carpool. And I never did have to drive carpool. So anyway, David went to Harrison, and then he went to Lewis and Clark, and then he went to Central. And he was actually a Westinghouse scholar at Central. He's very smart, like all my kids are very smart. And he's very thoughtful and very gentle. And he's also very caring. And he has a wonderful marriage. He's married to Rebecca. Rebecca is a nurse, and they met when he was an intern in Colorado, in Denver, at the Denver Veterans Hospital, and Rebecca was a nurse there. And that was how they met. And she finally said to him, either we're going to get married or we're breaking up. And so they got married. And that's something I love about Rebecca, is she says it like it is. And if you don't like it, that's too bad, but that's the way it is. And anyway, David is a wonderful father. He adores his daughter. And he's a mensch. I'm very proud of him. Well, all my children. You are all my children. You are the joy of my life, and you know that. But you need to hear it from me, because it's not enough to know it. You've got to also hear it. When I think back on my life, I think what I would have done without you, without every single one of you, are so important to me. And you're my blessings. And you know I love you. I will always love you. You can't do anything in the world that would make me stop loving you. And I'm just thankful for you. I don't know what else I can tell you, except that I am so thankful for you. Sandy sent me, on Thanksgiving, she sent me an email, and she said, what are you thankful for today? And I thought, what I'm thankful for are Carolyn, Jan, Joanne, and David, and Addie, and Zachary, and Hannah, and Elise. And that's what I'm thankful for.